Hello, everybody. Welcome and thanks for joining us for this really exciting webinar. I'm Lisa Dale. I'm on the faculty at the Columbia Climate School and I direct the MA in Climate and Society. I'm very happy to be here with Dean Alexis Abramson. She's the Dean of the Climate School, and Dean Jelani Cobb from the Journalism School. I'm not going to do long introductions for them. I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves. And let's get started with that with Dean Abramson. Tell us a little about you, how you got into this role, and then we'll turn to Dean Cobb.
Great. Hello, everybody, and excited to be here talking about this super important topic with you today and in partnership with the Journalism School. As Lisa mentioned, am the Dean of the Climate School. I've been here at Columbia since January 2025. Lots of things have happened since January 2025, and so I've really been kind of, along with many of you, in the thick of dealing with all of the chaos and craziness, both in higher education and with respect to climate. Prior to this role, I was the dean of the engineering school at Dartmouth College, but my background is in the energy and sustainability and climate space. I did a couple of years on sabbatical at the Department of Energy as a chief scientist there, with a focus on buildings and energy efficiency and building to grid, sustainable materials as well. And then also spent a year on another sabbatical working with a venture capital firm started by Bill Gates to look at how we invest in companies, startup companies that have significant potential to mitigate the climate change crisis. So happy to be here with you and talk about this important topic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Dean Cobb, tell us a little about how you got here.
My standard line for this, whenever someone asks, is I took the one train and I got
Yeah.
right off at 116th, let you out right in front of the building. But more substantively, I joined the faculty here in 2016, I taught ethics, I taught journalism ethics, I taught opinion writing, I taught reporting. I still teach those things. In addition, I have a course that I teach called American History for Reporting, and I teach a course on covering race. Kind of a little bit of a sampler platter of lots of different things. In August of 2022, I became dean of the journalism school after 6 years here on faculty. I have been, immediately when we thought about the pressing issues, we came to call them the kind of five pillars that we're focusing on. Uh, Two of them were interrelated, one of which was climate, which was jumped out, and we had the objective of having every journalist who graduates from the school be prepared to cover climate as it relates to their particular beat areas. If you are a person who covers agriculture, we want you to be able to think of the agricultural connections. If you're a person who covers politics, obviously there are lots of connections. If you're a person who covers sports, we want you to be able to see the connections there as well. And so that has been a central focus. And then one of the other themes of this conversation is that we very obviously have great reason to be concerned with misinformation and disinformation. And so that's been a focus of ours since before I became dean, but something that we have remained steadfastly very concerned about and very involved in mitigating in the course of my deanship as well.
Thanks so much. So we know certainly at the climate school as well, we're quite focused on science communications and media. So it seems like the two schools are certainly well aware of each other's disciplinary focus and working to tighten those connections. So that leads us to our important conversation about truth and trust here. For our audience, I'm going to be asking questions and facilitating a discussion for the next maybe 30 minutes. If you have questions, if you're watching this webinar, throw them in the Q&A. And when we're finished with our sort of preliminary conversation, we'll pull from those questions to carry the conversation forward. So just go ahead and throw them in that Q&A chat. So let's get started, and maybe we'll start with Dean Cobb for this one. Just to set the stage, how do you think about the concept of truth? And how does that manifest in your field, and why is that such a complicated question?
Well, I mean, I think that it typically had not been very complicated. You know, we tended to not go for the most grand or abstract philosophical understanding of truth. We went for the very practical, as journalism is an exceedingly practical undertaking. The very practical definitions of, you know, the preponderance of facts, and you know the accurate representation of a series of events or statements or actions and so on. And so we want to create reportage and coverage that is defensible in the face of the facts.
Mhm.
And we have, if that weren't a difficult enough task, we have the challenge of doing that very quickly, as quickly as possible. And so for us, truth is rooted in also, you know, fact checking, rigorous vetting, you know, someone making a statement, and then, you know, we have protocols that we walk through to the greatest extent possible to determine the veracity of that statement. And one of my favorite examples of this was in the New Yorker, where I described two counties as adjacent. And I knew that they were adjacent. You know, when the fact checker questioned me, I said, I drove from County A and I saw a sign that said you are now entering County B. Therefore, they are adjacent. And they dragged out satellite imagery that established that about 200 feet of a third county was present. So when I was driving for about 2 seconds, I was in a different county before I entered the third county. And so I had to describe them as nearby, not adjacent. And so we try to, in every practical sense, get to the facts that accurately represent reality. And that is our kind of journalistic ideal of truth.
It's a great story. Thanks for sharing it. Dean Abramson, what are your thoughts about the concept of truth, and what does that look like in your work and discipline?
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation about climate change, whether or not it exists, whether or not it's human driven, whether or not we're in crisis, right? And unfortunately, that has found its way into a variety of different sort of sectors, business sectors, also into citizens and global citizens who are trying to navigate the truth, right, around climate change and the impact that it might have. It's a very complex problem. If it weren't complex, we would have figured out a solution. So it's understandable, I believe, that there's going to be confusion around it. There's going to be misinformation. There's going to, unfortunately, be disinformation as well. And so what we really try to do is make sure that in our programs, in our courses that we offer, in the research that we do, in the impact work that we do, that we are integrating facts, similar to what Professor Cobb mentioned, right? We're integrating facts associated with climate change, associated with the energy transition, the opportunities and challenges it presents, associated with climate adaptation in certain parts of the world that will feel the effects of climate change more readily than others. That we're really trying the best we can as scientists, as policy influencers, as financial people who consider how to get investment to different parts of the world, that we're really trying to point to relevant sources that have strong reputations for fact-based information and pointing to those as much as we can in everything that we do.
Thanks. And that I think that raises a really important, dare I say, adjacent question to this topic, which is We all in our academic disciplines tend to approach the question of truth by needing more evidence and more citations. And yet we also know that even when we provide those ad nauseum, it doesn't always resolve and it doesn't always communicate well. And instead, one alternative strategy is more of a storytelling type of approach. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts, how you think about storytelling, whether you use that in your discipline, and how that functions in this world where truth feels a little bit hard to hold on to.
Mhm.
I'll open that up to either of you. Get us started.
I'll jump in.
Great.
So, storytelling is a complicated and inherently political undertaking. And as journalists, we're aware like stories are literally our stock and trade. They are the coin of our realm. But as I'm prone to remind my students, if we wanted a to give a story of, say, the American Civil War that had 100% fidelity to the relevant events of the war, that story would have to be 4 years long. And that would only be one person's version of it. And so obviously we wouldn't show a documentary that was 4 years long. And so you then get into the political process of editing and what you include, what you don't include. And for us, veracity and accuracy require that we include representative facts, or the greatest to the greatest extent that we include relevant facts within the constraints of however many words, 2,000 words that you have to write something, or 15 minutes that you have to do a documentary segment, or whatever it is that you're working on. And so for us, we're constantly going back and forth and engaging in this version of if this is consumed by someone, will someone say, oh, well, you deliberately left out this vantage point or this perspective? And, another kind of commonplace is that I'm often in conversations where someone will say something, a sentence will start to the effect of, what the media won't tell you is dot, dot, dot. And I will say that very often, in my experience, the media won't tell you that particular thing because we've actually looked into it and found it to not be true. And so that was why we didn't, say this particular, thing, was the case. And moreover, we're now seeing ways to integrate the broader version of this, the broader version of the story into the story. And what I mean by that is, for instance, PBS Frontline, which creates documentaries on news subject matter, is now, as opposed to if you sit for an interview for a documentary, you may talk for 45 minutes and then literally 45 seconds of what you said will wind up in the final product. But now PBS Frontline is uploading the entire interview. So the person can hear the 1 minute that was used on this one subject, but they can also hear the 44 other minutes where you talked about all these other things. And very often, which is, I know we have lots of things that we're disheartened by, but one of the more heartening signs is that often people will go back and listen to the entire raw interview in order to understand the context in which this person's comments were made. And so we have that kind of complicated relationship with storytelling where we're always trying to get as close to representation as possible.
I'm quite gratified to hear that people are watching and reading the
Yes.
45 minutes.
Mhm.
That's great news. I love that you're able to track that, and that's very promising. Dean Abramson, how would you address this same question?
Yeah, so I think, gosh, what everything that Dean Cobb says just really resonates so well. I think this is also a good point to make that in our climate programs that we offer, we need to be teaching this, right? How to tell information. And I think one thing we try to emphasize is, and I'm an engineer, so I want to go straight to the fact that like sea level has risen 8 inches since 1900, and that might not be the place to actually start the conversation, that actually talk about flooding and talk about areas of the country or of the world. Talk more specifically about how flooding, for example, is impacting families in Miami. And that bringing that kind of real piece into it is really important to that storytelling, to that building the trust as well. I think, and then also, and I've seen this in my own life, right? When I say something like that sea level has risen 8 inches, rightfully so, people question, how do you know that? And so it's really important when you are giving the facts, right, that you talk about how you know that. And just saying an expert told me probably isn't sufficient, right? Just like, well, it was tested over a number of years across a number of counties or countries, and that results pointed to the same trend. So pointing to sort of how that information was collected, also making people feel like, and we're continuing to look at this because maybe it'll change in the future, and understanding sort of what that is. And I think the last thing too, I might be getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I always now, and this is sort of a new thing for me, but really try to communicate through talking about what I think are shared values with other people. So the fact that we're trying to mitigate climate change means reducing pollution, and that means reducing incidence of asthma, right? And that there's health and safety and quality of life benefits that you get from working towards mitigating climate change. You also get greenhouse gas reductions, and that's complicated to understand the impact and indirect impacts of that. But talking a language that resonates from a shared value sense is also important.
That's great. And I think certainly the evidence suggests that making these kinds of issues personal and direct for people is the best way to reach them and get a response. So let me push a little more on this question. I think there's two other sort of particular challenges in speaking these truths and getting an audience to hear and understand what you're trying to convey. And one of those is the existence of scientific uncertainty. We don't always know. And how can we handle true moments of uncertainty without sort of damaging our credibility or casting doubt upon everything else we said? And I think related, and maybe part of this is, how can we think about sort of the mentality of a crisis? And this is something I think about a lot with my students. When we keep telling them we're in a crisis, this is a crisis, the climate crisis, and they get this, sort of terrified look and create more paralyzed anxiety than productive response. How can we balance sort of the uncertainty problem and the panic problem when we're speaking these truths?
Dean Abramson, do you want to go first?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So this is a huge problem for us. We have something, we're dealing with something uh, which I think people have termed news avoidance. And it's because it is paralyzing, and no one wants to uh, you know, pick up their phone or listen to a podcast where the prevailing message seems to be, we're all gonna die, so um, but I think that one potential solution, and one of the solutions that I've seen that news organizations are increasingly turning to, is that coverage, the crisis coverage, often now is taking a backseat to the policy coverage and the action coverage and the kind of political debate coverage. And, this is what's happening here, and this is what's happening in this instance. One of the probably lesser known examples of this was the infrastructure bill during the Biden presidency. And the media didn't do a great job of that. But I think that in the aftermath of that, and of explaining the climate implications for it and all the climate mitigation, parts of that bill that were, really significant. And I think in the aftermath of that, I've seen more of a call for explanatory reporting. This is what's happening here. This is what's happening on the ground. Here are some strategies that people are deploying or that industry has come up with that could be useful in these kinds of ways. And, even as uh, the New York Times is famously, says all the news that's fit to print. But everything that's fit to print is also not necessarily going to be consumed. And some things are going to be, quite frankly, traumatizing if it's just uh, warning on top of warning on top of warning. And so we have to spread that out and intermix, other kinds of coverage that give people a sense of what they can do and what other people actually are doing in the face of this.
Thanks. I really like that explanatory reporting concept. Dean Abramson, how are you thinking about
Yeah,
these issues?
just to sort of build on what Dean Cobb said, I think also, I think sometimes as scientists, as reporters, we don't acknowledge the uncertainty as much as we should. And I don't know, maybe that's because we're trying to kind of bring it down to fewer words and sort of explain what's going on. Maybe it's because sort of either consciously or unconsciously, we don't want to admit the uncertainty. So an example is the wildfires in California that destroyed so many homes and ecosystems and uprooted families, right? Some of the reporting you saw on that said this is due to climate change. And some of the reporting on that said, well, it's kind of sort of due to climate change. And it could be, but it's really hard to know. And those, just both of those ways of reporting are just really challenging. So I think we need to do a better job to identify that there is uncertainty, right? We can't confidently say that this wildfire wouldn't have happened if it were not for climate change, right? And so thinking about how we integrate that uncertainty. One thing I like to emphasize is that climate models, for example, like there's uncertainty in climate models because it's an extremely complex problem, not because we don't understand the science to the extent that we can. But that uncertainty has narrowed over time, and helping to communicate that we have low confidence, medium confidence, high confidence, right? And we used to have low confidence, but that confidence has improved, and being able to point to that, I think, is really important. We need to do a better job of that, I would say.
So now let's add a sort of additional layer of complexity to this discussion, because not only are we reaching maybe skeptical audiences with information that may cause them to panic or that may cause them to doubt the veracity or the certainty of what we're sharing, but we're also operating in this incredibly polarized landscape where ideological divisions invisibly interfere with who we trust and whose information we can process and internalize. How do you think about overcoming those ideological divides, or how do those factor into the way you strategically think about communications in your fields? Dean Cobb, let's start with you.
I don't want to go first every time. I don't want to like kind of jump. I don't want to be the person going, ooh, 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 pick me. But I will jump into that one. I will
Great.
jump into that one. But um, so that's again, that's a very real problem for us. And one of the things, going back to kind of an earlier part of the conversation, one of the things that I've advocated, in the profession is to narrow the degree to which we are even asking the public to trust us. And so if you don't trust us, that's fine. And as I point out to my colleagues in journalism, I say journalists are some of the least trusting people in the world. We don't trust anybody as a professional requirement. So we can't be entirely, taken aback when people take the same stance towards us. What we do need, however, is for them to apply that skepticism equally. Don't trust us, but also don't trust the person who tells you that climate change is not happening, or that climate change is not happening as a result of human actions. Don't trust anyone. So where does that leave you if you don't trust anyone implicitly? We then have to take the second step of showing our work, showing everything that we did to get to a particular conclusion. And I've said that, for any journalism piece that has any kind of controversial assertion or anything that people might take issue with, we should include a hyperlink that says how this story was reported. And it's like, I received a tip that led me to file a Freedom of Information Act request with this agency, which then led me to confront this city council member and ask this series of questions, which you can hear right here. Here's the audio of this. Here are my notes from the city council meeting that I went to, and so on, and walk people through. The difference between journalism, at least good journalism, and the conspiratorial ramblings of charlatans is that we can show our work. They can't. And I think that puts us, that doesn't get you entirely over the ideological divide, doesn't get you entirely past people who are predisposed to think that, we're fake news or whatever. But it does get you maybe 10%, maybe 15% closer. And in the society that we're living in now, those margins are important.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate sort of the practical suggestion and a way to sort of tackle this directly. Dean Abramson, what does this look like in the climate space?
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said. We need to do a better job in those ways. I also think of it, it might not be so much on the reporting side, but just in the general communication kind of landscape, to help overcome ideological divides. Really, some of the things I was talking about before, a focus on shared values, and humanizing kind of the problem is helpful as well. One example I'd like to give is I've talked to people in the United States, for example, who are buying in or have bought into the idea that we're not in crisis, right? They might acknowledge that climate change exists, but that we shouldn't be putting a lot of money and effort and time and science and research and all of that into the problem. And kind of the discussions I've had is understandable that they might see it that way. And, I might start talking to them about whether or not, are they only concerned about the United States, or do they themselves find themselves, are they interested in supporting making lives better across the world? And inevitably, many of them say yes. A lot of them might volunteer in other parts of the world or have at certain time in their life. They might give charitable contributions to, different foundations or organizations or nonprofits in parts of the world to help people live better lives, quality of life in other parts of the world. And so sometimes I'll frame it in such a way that the climate change crisis might not be affecting you in your life directly right now, but it actually is affecting people in parts of the global south, for example, that are seeing such increased extreme weather events that they're having to move and migrate to other parts of the world. And so I'll talk about it from that perspective, and should the United States be helping those people, right? And just kind of putting that out there. But I also think, and this is something that we all need to do a better job with, and I'd like to have more at the climate school, is we do this, but do more of it, is teaching how to have dialogue. And I really mean dialogue. I do not mean debate. That oftentimes you are not going to convince the person on the other side of anything, no matter how much fact and statistics and that you can check you have. And this idea that we have to practice listening to understand and building trust, and how important that sort of going down that listen to understand, asking people about their experiences, right, with an extreme weather event. Or maybe they have an aunt, or a cousin who had to deal with a hurricane or a wildfire, and talk about that with not a goal to convince, because I think through that kind of productive dialogue, that then breeds some curiosity in other people. And hopefully that then leads to them kind of going down a path over time to get more information.
I think curiosity is the fundamental thing. You know, um, if you can spark a question that a person can, will send a person, uh, on a quest or send them down a rabbit hole that may lead them to conclusions that they can claim for themselves, you have a much better chance of changing someone's mind than if you just kind of do the heavyweight champ version of bludgeoning someone with fact after fact after fact. And what you get is the kind of instinctive self-defense, of their own way of viewing the world.
Absolutely. Totally agree. So we got to figure out how to do that better.
Which leads me to my next question, and maybe the last question that will come from me. We have a few good questions coming from the audience, but let's close out this portion of the section by sort of going deeper on what's just come up, which is I'm going to ask two pieces of this. The first piece is what's happening at your respective schools? How are students in your schools being educated specifically to address and respond to these challenges? So how are we teaching them at the climate school, for example, these communication skills? How are we teaching our students to be able to operate within this polarized environment? So what does that look like? How's that trickling down to the classroom? And then related, if we have time to chat about this as well, how is the climate school and the journalism school starting to work together? And what are the opportunities that we see to build on those early efforts? Dean Abramson, get us started.
So I think with respect to the students in the classroom, right, we need to do a better job embedding communication into every discipline so that it's not treated sort of as this optional soft skill anymore, but it's really part of our scientific or policy training or journalism training, right? Which maybe it is more obviously part of journalism training, but bring that into the what we do and what they do in engineering and medicine and nursing, and so making sure it's more part of that conversation. I think also, I would argue, right, we need to practice more of that. So that learning by practicing that dialogue, we need to bring in more speakers who have different opinions than we do. Credible sources, but different opinions, drawing different conclusions based on credible information, and having those conversations directly with them. So that our students are having those kinds of experiences. Also, I would say sort of bringing in some of the psychology of belief and behavior, of human sort of interaction. That sometimes is a focus in psychology courses or even organizational courses at the business school. But how do we kind of bring that in so that people learning about climate change are actually also learning about social psychology and behavioral economics and cognitive science, and teaching how identity and values and trust are really shaping perception of humans. So I would bring that into it. And there's obviously strong connections then to the journalism school in some that we've had in the past, some that we're talking about for the future, to bring our schools even closer together.
Yeah, what we have is on some levels a very big Venn overlap between the pressing questions that the climate school is grappling with and the pressing questions that the journalism school is trying to navigate. And, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, there are other kinds of initiatives I think are really useful, like the Trust Collaboratory and the listening tables that we've had, and the journalism schools collabed with SEPA and the law school, and if I start going through, I'll end up like leaving people out, but. Um, and I think that's been a really great model of the kind of thing that Dean Abramson is talking about. On the other side of it, I think for us in the journalism school, we're doing everything from teaching people specifically about reporting in hostile circumstances. Some of that happens in the core reporting class. Some of that happens in things that are happening outside, of that. So for instance, we just had a event celebrating the 40th anniversary of Reporters Without Borders, and it was a very real, very frank conversation about the kinds of dangers that people encounter when they're doing this work, particularly in the kind of polarized environment that we're in now. And then finally, just to reiterate part of Dean Abramson's point, um, we are always in conversation. We're actually in conversations now about the ways in which we can work together and the ways in which our schools can provide some key element to each other, and we get at the best of this bigger institution by our capacity to collaborate around specific important things like this.
Wonderful. I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have come in. So I'm just going to read word for word the way these questions have been submitted. So here's the first question. This is a great question. In recent months, many scientists, including climate scientists, have stopped talking on the record with journalists.
Mm.
What are your practical suggestions to journalists and to scientists how to accurately inform the public about climate under these circumstances?
I'll
Go
go.
ahead. Yeah, that's a journalism question there for you, Jelani.
But it's very funny because I keep feeling like that kid that's in the front of the class who's like, ooh, 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 pick me, pick me. Um, no, I mean that's a very difficult situation. If I'm, kind of looking at the broadest scope of it, it's not just in climate. There are people who are hesitant to talk on the record about a lot of things because we have a very kind of retribution-oriented politics, in the White House at the moment. And so, I should not say in the moment because at varying times, different administrations, Democrat and Republican, have both had a kind of hostility toward the press, and maybe not at the decibel that we're seeing now. But I don't want to idealize the kinds of such circumstances we were dealing with prior to this. That said, it's useful for people to talk off the record. It's useful for people to give you background information. And what I talk to my students about, and what often is the case, I know that my colleagues on the faculty also convey this, is that getting someone to go on the record is usually not what happens in the first conversation.
Mhm.
And it's often something, especially if it's a very weighty issue, you may talk to someone four times or five times or more
Mm.
before they agree to actually go on the record with you. There's a long, complicated conversation to be had about the way that reporting is depicted in popular culture. But one of the best examples of reporting, there are lots of terrible examples. One of the best examples of how this process works is the film She Said, where you talk to someone, they don't want to go on the record, they don't even open the door. And you talk to someone else, and that person gives you information, and maybe the fact that this other person is talking on the record makes it more likely for the first person to talk on the record. And you go back and go back in this kind of circle, bearing in mind, and that movie chronicles the reporters who broke the Harvey Weinstein story, the New York Times reporters, and then also Ronan Farrow, who broke it at the New Yorker. But in that story, one of the things that journalists know, or people who are familiar with it, know that there were at least two other nationally prominent reporters who were on to Weinstein years earlier
Hmm.
and dropped the story in frustration because they went around and around and around, and no one would go on the record with them. And so sometimes, that's part of the story.
Mm. How interesting. I'm reminded of Dean Abramson's comments about the wisdom of social psychology in sort of
Mhm.
building trust and what we know about how people build trust slowly and over time. And it's a really nice connection. Dean Abramson, what would you add to that?
Just the one thing that I would add is that training, and again, my area of background is more scientists and engineers, but certainly everybody in academia, training us to be better, um, more comfortable with sort of modern media, the modern media ecosystem, right? So I think because we can so easily end up on social media,
Mm.
in addition to getting that call from the New York Times, that we all could benefit from more media training. We offer it optional right now here and there for faculty who are interested, but I think maybe making it more of regular practice. That way, I mean, certainly if somebody wants to talk, doesn't want to speak, fine. But sometimes they don't want to speak because they don't know how to speak in such a way that they might convey their ideas while at the same time not putting themselves or their science at risk. And so I think more sort of education and training would be good to help that.
That comment really tees up nicely the next question from an audience question, which gets into this role of social media and how we can think about that. So here's the question. What can be learned from the Gen Z and millennial influencers who seem to be the current news carriers for a large portion of the population and may spread disinformation or misinformation without regard for veracity? How should our storytelling skills evolve to reach the consumers who are now listening to influencers? And what do we do in general when these facts become less effective than these sort of influencer vibes?
Mm.
Good
Vibes.
questions. Vibes, good question.
Eh, I think that one, there is a kind of complementary space. Influencers are people who are commenting on, current events, and I'm not a person that believes that. I mean, I believe in democracy, and this is a kind of civic square. That said, the problem is more that we conflate what influencers do with what journalists do.
Hmm.
Very often, there is some overlap, but very often these are distinct categories. And to a striking degree, influencers are often referring to, riffing on, responding to journalism, work that has actually been done by journalists. That journalist is not, out in front of the courthouse drawing attention to themselves. As a matter of fact, they're doing the very opposite. They're trying to not draw attention to themselves and facilitate actually getting the story. But when you see an influencer go live, 20 minutes later, they're responding to news that was broken by a reporter very often. That said, I do think that traditional journalism has some things to learn about how the influencer world has been able to develop these kinds of parasocial relationships and has been able to develop a kind of branding that brings people back to them and so on. They've figured out how to navigate the digital world in a way that is more fluid and more uh, skillful than very often the way that we do as practitioners of the craft. And so I think that there's a kind of way that you can kind of do both of those things. And then lastly, the journalism school has been thinking about these questions about what are the things that we do that can be useful to people in the influencer world. Maybe you don't think that you need to spend a year here, studying, or maybe you don't think that you need to do our, 6-week investigative course. But perhaps there's a week-long course on media law that you might find useful, or maybe there is a short course on basic reporting that you would find valuable, or even production skills. And I think that if we are providing skills for people who are operating in that world, we're still fulfilling our mandate as a journalism school.
Yeah, maybe I'll add to that by saying what's great, and I apologize, I'm going to generalize, but in a lot of Gen Z people that I talk to, like they are very concerned about climate and they really want to get engaged. So while I agree, there's misinformation and disinformation out there, I also think this is a great opportunity to involve sort of the Gen Zers and the influencers in an issue that if they understood better, and it's a very complex issue, so understanding it to the minute details very, very hard. Even I don't, but understanding, communicating about it better through social media platforms is really important. And I will say that then takes making sure that we have efforts underway to do that. I know the World Bank, for example, has sort of they host youth takeovers through social media on issues related to climate and other kind of global challenges. I think, I during New York City Climate Week, I did a podcast called Sing for Science, right? And that was partnering a musician, with a climate scientist in that particular case, right, to talk about these things. I'm sure there are better people than me to do this, but that kind of effort and having, meeting sort of social media where it is with more fact-based, expert involved type social media outlets is a great way to continue to have impact through those kinds of channels.
But did you sing? That's a
Well,
question.
I was ready to sing, and I'm not a great singer, but they did not ask me to sing. But the
I had
name
Wow.
the
of the
same
I know,
question.
it was, yeah, the name of the song that they were focused on was called Inertia, and it was sort of about like, there was a line in there about like I wanted to save the planet, but I didn't, feel like it today, kind of. And there's a line in the song about that. And so instead, I just explained what inertia was and how you can use it the other way to keep momentum going to save the planet. So
Well, that's the great.
I got that in there.
I propose that we conclude this interview with a duet.
Yes, I was going to propose the same thing.
Okay,
I
I'll
can't I,
ask.
I can't sing,
I
so
can't either.
I could not locate a tune with a GPS. So
All right, we've got one more final question from the audience, and I'll read this one. One of our audience members says, I decided after leaving the J School to focus equally on business and environmental journalism. What are the most effective ways to get people to connect those dots between climate change and the wider economy to the pocketbook of the news consumer? What are
I
the best?
really, I
Yeah,
really love that question. And so I suspect that you are probably further along in figuring that out than I am. But always, I think the way that one of the things that one of my mentors told me early on in my career was that a complex story should be told simply. And this is a very complicated story, as Dean Abramson pointed out. And then, for you being at the nexus of two fields, it becomes even more complicated as an undertaking. But I think when you find the narrowest portal to enter the story, the thing that is the most distinct business interest, that supply chain disruptions are more common because there are bigger hurricanes. I don't know if that's true. I'm just using that as an example.
Yes.
Or right. Or if you're saying one thing that I do know is true because we did investigative reporting about this at the journalism school, is that worker heat deaths are increasing significantly. And this is not only a kind of moral concern, but it's an economic concern and potentially an area of legal exposure
mhm.
for companies. And I think that when we get into the ways in which we are living with and will continue to live with the impacts of the changing climate, that makes it a little bit more. We talk about climate change in bold face lettering or neon, that automatically puts up people's defenses. When we report on life, when we report on day-to-day problems, the most practical element of how people run a business or how people make payroll or the bottom line or any of those things, it gets us closer to people being able to grasp the bigger meta story of climate.
I think those are all great points. I think we well, we really need to, I think, come together even more to make sure that what we're communicating, what we all kind of need to work together, sort of what I was thinking about, to come together to make sure we're collaborating together on these issues, that we're making sure that the information between business and the environment, that you've got experts on sort of both sides that are bringing those pieces together. And to Dean Cobb's point, I think making it as simple as possible is really key. It used to be that we kind of had to talk about mitigating climate change on moral grounds, and now we can talk about it from economic grounds. We can talk about it as a quality of life or healthcare, health improvements. And so making sure that we're kind of homing in on that kind of messaging is really critical as well.
Well, we're just about out of time. I want to thank both of you for a really robust and wide-ranging discussion. I think we discussed sort of disciplinary challenges in journalism and in climate change and a lot of the ways that those intersect. And I really appreciated also some of the very specific and practical, even actionable ideas for tackling some of these problems. And I think we're all looking forward to ongoing collaborations between our two schools going forward. So thanks very much for your time, and thanks to the audience for all of the great questions.
Thank you for
Thank you,
your great
everyone.
moderation. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa.
Thanks all.
All right, take care.